We already start our Facebook transmission.
Okay.
لو حكيتوا كان حضرنا بدهم كوبي من الأجندة. أمريتا and Lopez will follow exactly the sequence in the agenda.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this is we agree on that.
Yes. My suggestion is to go as per the sequence, the same sequence of the plan. So because the topics are aligned well. So I think it is important to start with Jane. So we start broad and then we go a bit narrower as we go along.
We'll start with Werner, right?
Yes.
That's right. Mr. Werner will be our special guest.
We start with Werner for the welcome, and then with the video recording, then with Her Excellency.
Her Excellency.
And then the speakers.
Yes. Yeah, I think I'm convinced that things will go smoothly, inshallah. Hope everything will be smooth. And of course, we will help each other. As 3 shares, we are organizing this event.
Yes, great example setting.
And they are very happy, I think, at WTO, because they tend to encourage joint chairs activities. This is what the message that I received.
Exactly, it's the cross not only cross the regions, so it even cross the continents. That's a first. That was actually it was the minister in Austria. She first didn't believe it. She thought, "Is it really this way?" I think it's quite unexpected that you're joining forces like this.
I'm happy to hear that.
Especially because the time schedule was quite difficult. Okay, it's 10 in Chile. What time is in Amman now? Let's try to fix it.
It was confusing in the beginning, but now it's okay. I think we get.
Yeah, we got the hang of it. I'm just messaging Anush and Simonetta.
والله أنا شخصيا لا، إذا بتحبوا إذا بتشرب مي إذا هلا إحنا عندنا في القاعة إيش اللي طالع الكل. Presentation, right, Anush?
You have, yes.
Anush and Amrita have a joint research, and based on that, they will do a joint presentations.
Yes.
Am I understanding correctly?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So who will start? I will start with Anush.
Yes, please.
WTO.
Yes.
Is that okay with you?
Yes, we'll start with Anush and then myself.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the people that is in Facebook and that is listening to us, we will start on time. We are just waiting that it's 4 p.m. in Oman, 10 in Chile, 8 in Mexico.
I think the issue are very common and very interesting for all policymakers in 3 countries. This is the important thing in our webinar, and we are trying to raise policy issues that policymakers in Jordan and Chile and of course Mexico can listen and use.
So Anush and Simonetta, they're joining now. They're joining in 30 seconds. We'll soon have them both.
Yeah, we have them both, huh? Okay.
Yeah, no, we don't have them both yet, but in 30 seconds, we'll have them both. They're joining now.
Okay, we'll wait. We have time.
Mhm.
I hope we will not need extension of our webinar time. You agree there is no room for extension, time extension.
Yeah, with webinars, you have to be careful because the attention span is not the same as with physical meetings.
This is my understanding. Correct.
We have now also in the WTO, our training courses used to be all day with physical meetings. Now we usually do half days with study time and people talking to each other. But you cannot do more than half a day of training over Zoom.
That's right. Yeah. It's a long time. Half a day is a long time.
Yeah.
Here we have Simonetta.
We have Simonetta, yes. Hi, Simonetta.
I think we can special announce.
Hello, everybody. I hope I was not late.
Did we bother you on the vacation? Are you still on vacation?
No. I am back.
Ah, great.
الانترنت ايش ان شاء الله ما يصير فيه مشكله. والله الانترنت اهم شيء. ها؟ لا يعني احنا من برا اذا بده يزيد. انا؟ لا بس انا سجلت.
سجلنا احنا سجلنا.
بس انا داخل عن طريق اليوزر تاعي.
Dorothea, is there audience link that I can share on social media, like just a tweet right now, for them to join us directly using Zoom, or should I do the Facebook Live?
I'm not sure. Are you asking me? I think.
No, I'm asking Dorothea if I can share a link. I have some messages, some people who want to join us, but they haven't registered. Maybe I can just directly share the Zoom link.
Maybe Dorothea.
I will send it to you in the chat, okay?
Sure, thank you.
Just
Here
one thing
we have-
before we get started. So
Yes.
Anisha's come on with the link that you sent to me. So if you could change her name, so it looks like Anisha.
خلينا نشوف.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Sorry, I missed the point. Is there any question for me?
No, I think we can start.
We shall start now?
I think so. I think.
Okay, then we'll start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on trade and gender. How can trade policy empower women and promote gender equality? My name is Talib Awad, Professor of Economics at the University of Jordan School of Business. I am also WTO shareholder. I will be moderating this webinar, which is organized jointly by the University of Jordan chairs and the University of Chile chair and the ITAM of Mexico as also chair. Recently, the subject of trade and gender has gained increasing importance at the global and domestic levels. At the global level, as you all know, two important developments took place. First, a group is formed within the WTO on gender and empowerment of women, formed at the WTO to augment the aims of Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. Second, a global trade gender agreement was signed by 3 important countries, Canada, Chile, and New Zealand, with the aims also to promote trade gender policies designed to improve gender equality and women's economic empowerment. At the domestic level, the government of Jordan has strengthened its commitments in recent years to gender equality and women's economic empowerment through the preparation of Women's Economic Empowerment Action Plan under the Mashriq Gender Facility, which is supported by the World Bank Group. Research in World Bank and WTO indicated that a gender gap is narrowing over time, which is good news, but at a very slow speed. I will tell you a brief about what our research results indicate to. We did preliminary research on gender gap in Jordan, and we found a very interesting relationship between the gender gap in Jordan and the level of education. As the gender gap tend to shrink as the higher level of education, or as we have higher level of education of females. Actually, it totally vanished, the gender gap, at the PhD level of education, which is interesting and indicate that new policies should be introduced to support higher education for both men and women, but especially for females. In this webinar, we have carefully selected a very distinguished speakers and presenters. All are very specialized in the area of trade and gender. They will cover topics related to trade and gender, like, for examples, what is the relationship between trade and gender, and how can trade affect female different than women? What the linkages between trade and women empowerment, and how can we use trade policies to maximize women empowerment and participation in labor market. These topics all, I think, will be covered by our distinguished presenters today. First of all, let me announce 2 points on the webinar proceedings. Webinar is being recorded, as first mentioned, to be available for post viewing. Second, there will be a room for questions and answers, but at the end of the presentations. So if you have, please, any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the question box at the bottom of the Zoom panel. I will be bringing these questions at the time of Q&A. I would like to begin the webinar with opening remarks from Mr. Werner Zinnes, the Director of Knowledge and Information Management Division at WTO. Mr. Werner obtained his PhD degree in law from St. Gallen University in Switzerland. Please, without more, he is very well known, without more details, Mr. Werner, you can please have the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Taleb. It's a pleasure to speak at this webinar. Welcome from Geneva. In the name of the entire WCP team, I congratulate the organizers to this, the shareholders of Jordan, Chile, Mexico, and Barbados, to their joint initiative taken on promoting policy dialogue on trade and gender. As the director responsible for the chair's program, I would also like to welcome the opening remarks by the Austrian Deputy Trade Minister Zimmermann and former Jordanian Minister of Industry, Trade and Supply, Ms. Ali, as well as our friends and our colleagues from UNCTAD, OECD at the WTO Gender Department, and of course our WTO chairs from the community who have co-organized this high-profile webinar and developed very topical trade and gender projects. The WTO Chairs Program aims to support and promote trade-related academic activities carried out by universities and research institutions in developing and least developed countries. Under the funding support from the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands, our chairs have been running various projects and workshops on trade-related matters. They are designed to offer an academic and policy-oriented platform where academics, policymakers, government officials, non-governmental organizations, and the business communities could exchange views, ideas, and experiences. It is very exciting for us to see this cross-continental initiative taken by our chairs from the Middle East, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, a truly cross-continental venture on trade and gender, an important topic that has been receiving increasing attention globally in the last few years since the Ministerial Conference of Buenos Aires in the WTO, and it has become now an even more relevant topic in the post-COVID-19 recovery. Policy-oriented applied research on gender equality and trade has been held back by limited data foundations, as well as by a lack of understanding of the linkages between the economic roles women play as traders, workers, consumers, entrepreneurs, and decision makers. Therefore, it is essential for the Chairs Program to support academic research aiming to improve the understanding of the impacts of trade patterns and trade policy on gender equality, and to provide policymakers with scientific evidence on the benefits of trade for women, for equality, inclusiveness, and with evidence-based proposals for potentially policy-oriented solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown to us how seriously trade and supply chains can be disrupted. There's a real risk that some of the economic gains women have reaped through trade could be reversed by the COVID-19 crisis. As common economies emerge out of the crisis, it is important that governments generate long-term gender-inclusive growth by addressing the constraints that women face, exploring how women participate in and gain from trade as entrepreneurs, traders, workers, and consumers. A global coordinated response by governments and international organizations represented today on trade and gender is therefore essential to promote the conditions for a fast and resilient recovery and to create a foundation for more gender inclusive and sustainable trade conditions in the future. I hope this workshop, as part of the project pursued by our Middle Eastern, Caribbean, Central and South American chairs, comes up with some concrete policy recommendations, how governments, the international community, and the private sector can collectively, through complementary initiatives, create the conditions to ensure that women benefit from trade instead of being left behind in the post-pandemic period. I look forward to seeing the outcomes of this workshop and the research projects conducted by our 4 chairs generally, being published in the international trade policy journals, being conceptualized as trade policy recommendations and background materials for policymakers and interested parties, being disseminated as advocacy materials and policy briefs to governmental and non-governmental trade and gender communities in Latin and South America and the Caribbean region, and the Jordanian Chamber of Commerce and the Ministries of Industry, Trade, Women and Employment in Jordan. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful workshop. Thank you very much for offering me the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Werner, for this informative and interesting opening remarks and of course, the details on the issue of women empowerment. We appreciate your contribution. I would like also to have the presentation that is recorded for Ms. Cynthia Zimmerman, the Austrian Deputy Federal Minister for Trade and Digitalization. Please note, however, that due to Austrian National Day holiday, which is coincide with the date of this webinar, we're going to listen to video recording of her presentation. Please let's have the video start.
I'm very sorry that I had to pre-record my message to you for this webinar. I would have enjoyed a more direct discussion with all of you. However, I'm still happy to talk to you about the WTO JAS program. So the Austrian Ministry for Digital and Economic Affairs is very proud to be a key donor for the new phase of this important initiative. With the JAS program, the world's trade organization can extend the reach of its technical assistance directed at government officials by involving university chairs serving as multipliers in beneficiary countries. The aim is to build capacity and generate expertise on the ground in beneficiary countries, particularly in LDCs, and I'm happy to say it works. The JAS program generates excellent long-term sustainability by capitalizing academic specialization and increasing over the course of professional careers of the teams at these universities. I also think it is very important for the program to focus on topics most relevant to policymakers, stakeholders, including those covered by WTO committee work and negotiations. This includes a topic which is very dear to me personally, that's the area of women and trade. With 127 WTO member states participating in a joint initiative on trade and gender, I think it is fair to say that there is massive interest for this topic among WTO member states. This is especially important because this topic obviously concerns every single member state, rich and poor, small and large alike. Trade has a role to play in fostering women's empowerment, advancing gender equality. Investing in women and integrating them in the economy impacts job creation, economic diversification, innovation, entrepreneurship, poverty reduction, and development. Gaining a better understanding of how women are affected by trade will be essential as countries develop and the global economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries that harness these opportunities will be rewarded with an expanded, more highly skilled workforce that can increase productivity and incomes. Women have an important opportunity to move into higher skilled work through trade, but these opportunities depend on putting in place complementary policies that increase investment in human capital, particularly in the areas of education and health. Such investments, which have become even more relevant in the post-COVID-19 recovery, would enable women to participate fully in the economy and reap the benefits of digital technologies. Complementary policies should include improved access to finance, including trade finance, and the elimination of legal barriers that women still face in many, many countries. So I hope that the incoming MC12 and the ministerial statement on trade and gender will give another boost to our work, and to realize that our work is currently producing outcomes which are legally non-binding. But these outcomes are still useful and have become more definitive over the last months, which is certainly good. So I therefore wish you every success and fruitful and productive discussions at your webinar about this very important issue. Thank you.
Many thanks for this excellent and encouraging speech. Please allow me to grab the opportunity to wish a happy National Day to Austrian people. And on behalf of all WTO chairs, to express our deep thanks and appreciation for the generous donation of Austrian government to the academic activities of WTO Shares program. Our next special speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Maha Ali. She is an international trade specialist with broad experience in trade and industrial policies. She has MBAs, a trade policy diploma, and baccalaureate degree in industrial engineering. Ms. Ali served twice as Jordan's Minister of Industry and Trade and Supply. Ms. Ali also is heavily involved in women empowerment initiatives and activities. The stage is yours, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Dr. Taleb, for the introduction. It is a great honor and pleasure to be with you all in this seminar, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this seminar. Mr. Werner Zudek from the WTO, also it's a great pleasure to meet you in this seminar, and I would like to join Dr. Taleb in congratulating Austria for their National Day. The topic of the seminar is really important, and I believe the timing of the seminar is also important. Women have an important role in trade, whether that is as consumers or as workers or as decision makers. Trade can generate opportunities for women's engagement in economic development. So the need to greater integrate women in international trade has been on the agenda of policymakers for years. And I believe what Dr. Taleb mentioned about establishing a group at the WTO on gender and women economic empowerment is indeed an important step. Raising women's participation in the workforce stimulates economic development, since in most countries, women constitute around 50% of the population. Research has shown that trade creates better jobs for women, since companies that export employ more women, pay them higher wages, and offer better benefits and job security. I quoted this from a publication by the World Bank in 2020 with the title of The Role of Trade in Promoting Women's Equality. So we've seen from this research three important statements on this aspect. If we look at some indicators, the Global Gender Gap Index, which is issued by the World Economic Forum, and it covers four main areas, starting with economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. In its 2021 report, it showed that the gender gap in economic participation remains the second largest of the four key gaps tracked by the index. The report also explains that the proportion of women among skilled professionals continues to increase, as does the progress towards wage equality, but still there is a persistent lack of women in leadership positions, with women representing only 27% of all manager positions on a global level. And the report also highlights that almost 80% of men aged between 15 and 64 are in the labor force versus only 52.6% women of the same age group. This is on a global level. If we go into more details on the MENA region, and mainly the Arab countries, female participation in the workforce stood at 20% in 2019, according to the ILO and World Bank data. And this represents around the half, to be accurate, 42% of the world average, which was around 47% in 2019. So we need to work more and more in the Arab region towards the increasing the participation of women in the workforce. When comparing the MENA countries, we find that Qatar has the highest participation, where it registered 57% in 2019, and Yemen is the lowest at 6%, and Jordan has the rate of 15% of participation of women in the labor force, which is below the regional average. I would like to share with you also some other indicators from Jordan from the year 2018. This is the most updated available, where it shows that females had 12.6% of leading positions in the public sector. Female ministers constituted around 24% of cabinet. Female diplomats represent 18.8% of all diplomats. Female judges represented 22%. Female representation in political parties was around 35%. And in parliament, it's 12%. It's according to a quota by law. So we can see that there are, in certain areas, the indicators are high, and I think Jordan is performing very well. But in other areas, and mainly in the private sector, I believe that we still need to do more. A study by the IFC was conducted in 2015 on, it surveyed around 1,200 publicly listed and private shareholding Jordanian companies, and it found that women held only 6% of board positions. And these figures varied depending on the industry. So we found that the highest percentage was in the health sector, where it was around 10%, while the lowest was in the financial sector, around 4%. New global trends in international trade, including digital economies, bring new economic opportunities for women. Digital technology and the use of online platforms provides lots of opportunities for women to overcome many of the challenges. And I do believe that these developments provide for women to increase their economic participation and make use of these digital solutions and such digital transformation, which we've seen it really progressing very well in Jordan, for example, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. To talk more about Jordan, the unemployment rate registered in Jordan recently is quite high. It reached around 24.8% for the second quarter in 2021, with 50% of it among youth and 27% among females. And this is really a big challenge in the country. It's driven by decreased economic growth, decreased FDI flows, and increased production costs. And many of these factors have been increased and augmented because of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the Jordanian economy. So the government has worked on putting in place a number of actions and projects through an economic priority program to overcome these challenges, which I will be talking about in a minute. But before talking about that, the research and studies in Jordan have showed that many of the challenges that are facing women in terms of their economic participation, and some of the reasons that were cited by women for not working outside home include the following: social norms, low wages and unattractive employment opportunities, lack of safe transportation services, lack of adequate and affordable childcare, the need to balance household responsibilities and work, women-unfriendly workplaces, access to entrepreneurship and finance. And I believe many of these factors are common to many countries. Enhancing women's economic participation has been always among the priorities of the Jordanian government and has always had the support of His Majesty King Abdullah and Her Majesty Queen Rania. The Jordan National Commission for Women has developed the National Women's Strategy, encompassing the government's vision of women's empowerment and the national plans that address different areas of gender equality. The strategy covers the period 2020 till 2025 and has among its main pillars women economic empowerment, with focus on increasing adequate job opportunities for females and encouraging women entrepreneurship. I will talk very quickly about our new or our economic priorities and economic plan that we have put in place, that the government has put in place a few months ago in order to overcome and in order to help the Jordanian economy to recover from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This program has a number of economic priorities. It includes around 53 priorities with specific projects and actions with main objectives to enable the private sector to create jobs, increase and provide incentives to FDI and local investment, increase exports of goods and services. I like to talk about this because within these three objectives, we find an indirect relation to enhancing women's economic participation. If we are able to increase our exports, this will have its indirect impact on women. The same applies to investment and to the other objectives. We had a study that was issued in September of this year by the Business and Professional Women Association in Jordan, which I would like to share with you some of its results. The study was conducted in cooperation with SIPES on the impact of the pandemic on women-owned businesses. And the study covered 500 companies. It covered the period from December 2020 till May 2021. It showed that around 74% of women-owned businesses were micro companies. 22% were small and 4% were medium-sized. The study also showed that only 2.5% of the study sample were able to use the loan facility that the government has put in place during the pandemic to support SMEs. This program had subsidized interest rates to assist SMEs, so only 2.5% of the sample were able to use it. And 50% of the study sample were forced to lower their prices, 30% had to reduce the number of their employees, and only 6% were able to go back to their normal operations after the end of the study. I found it useful to share these figures because it shows us how much women-owned businesses and females face challenges in the operation of their businesses and in the overall operation of the economy. I would like to end my comments with a number of recommendations, which I find are important to take into consideration in policy making. And I will be sharing some of the ideas that were implemented in Jordan. I see the recommendations to look at three main pillars. The first pillar is how to enhance employability of women. The second pillar, how to promote women entrepreneurship and participation in international trade. And the final one is how to improve access to finance. Going back to the first pillar on enhancing employability of women, it is important to provide capacity building and training opportunities to females to increase their employability as well as their career development. Because we see lots of females in low-skilled positions in many aspects, in professional positions, but when it comes to leadership and leading positions, we see a decreasing number of women. And this can be achieved by putting in place rules that require employers and service providers to allocate an obligatory percentage for females in their training and capacity building programs, wherever this is applicable. There's a need also to improve public transportation services, as this is a complaint in many countries like Jordan, where having adequate transportation services would help women to get fair opportunities in terms of their jobs. The concept we've applied in Jordan, a very interesting concept, which we call satellite units, where factories are allowed to open branches in areas that are identified as pockets of poverty or with high unemployment rates. And the government provides financial support to the investor. And we had lots of success stories where these satellite factories were opened in rural areas, as I mentioned. And most of the workers in these factories were from women and mostly in the garment industry. It is also important to require employers to provide women-friendly workplaces and suitable childcare services, and such requirements should be stipulated in national laws and regulations. And we've implemented that in the Jordanian law, where, for example, the provision of childcare services, if the number of female workers are more than a certain number stipulated in the regulation, the employer has to provide this childcare service, whether in the premises of the company or by outsourcing. Enforcing national programs for improving work conditions is also important. We do have a successful story to tell about Jordan, where we've implemented a program called Better Work Jordan, which was established in 2009 as a partnership between the UN International Labour Organization and the IFC of the World Bank, as well as the Jordanian Ministry of Labour. And this program engages with workers, employers, and the government to improve working conditions and boost competitiveness, and mainly it focused on the garment industry. Finally, flexible hour systems. This is very crucial to encourage women participation in the labor market. And Jordan has introduced that a few years ago in a bylaw of the Jordanian labor law, where it regulated flexible hours. It's not obligatory, but it gives the right to the employer and the employee to apply such a flexible hour system. And I believe the pandemic did really make lots of businesses and business owners to realize how flexible hours were really helpful at that time. On the issue, Dr. Talib, am I on time or did I exceed the time allowed for me?
You are on time. No
on time, okay.
Almost close to
yes.
Use your all time.
I will be quick. On the second pillar, on promoting women entrepreneurship and participation in international trade, I believe this is one of the most important pillars. Providing services that can address women is really important. For example, in Jordan, we do have many export-related services, export promotion, export development, SME support programs, but none of these programs are dedicated for women. So one of the business and professional associations in Jordan was really creative last year in coming up with establishing an export unit dedicated for exporting women. And this unit is really doing an excellent job in raising the awareness and providing training, providing information for women-owned businesses on export opportunities, how to develop their exports, how to market their products, and many other services, which I believe is a successful also story to replicate. Providing SMEs and startup support programs to target women is also important, such as business incubators and business accelerators. Again, we have many of these services in Jordan, but none of them are dedicated mainly for women. We have, of course, among the participants, both women and men as business owners, but as much as these services are increased, this will help in reaching out as much as possible to women entrepreneurs. Providing a legislative framework to allow women to establish and operate their businesses from home is also important. In Jordan, we have a few years ago issued regulations that allow for licensing your business from home with a number of activities, a list of activities. And this has helped many women to establish a small, let's say, or micro business at home while it is licensed and it's a formal business. And this helps in providing, of course, in increasing women participation in the economy. Providing preferential treatment to women-owned SMEs in government procurement is an area that is worth also looking at. Engaging women-owned businesses' participation in business delegations. Throughout my experience in the government, I rarely really see women participating in business delegations traveling abroad or even in B2B meetings. Sometimes this is a man club thing. So it's really important to promote the participation of women entrepreneurs as well as women-owned businesses or businesses managed or led by women in business delegations. And this can be further supported or encouraged by providing financial support to this category of businesses to enable them to participate in these business delegations as well as in trade fairs. Include female workers as part of the criteria and conditions for any kind of domestic support programs that are provided in the country, such as SME support programs or export incentives, grants, technical assistance. It will be useful if one of the conditions or criteria for a company to be eligible for such support is to have women amongst its workers. Promote women participation in leadership positions in both government and private sector is crucial. In the private sector, it is important to work more on promoting executives and board members. There are studies by the IFC that show that there is a linkage between having women on boards and the enhanced, let's say, performance in terms of governance of such companies. Under the Jordanian Companies Law, there is ongoing work to include provisions to encourage boards to appoint females by reporting on the number of female board members and reasons in case of not having women on boards. This is an issue that is still under study, but work is being done on this. Another good initiative also that was done by the Chambers of Commerce and Industry in Jordan, where they established yes, I think this is my final point, where they established committees of their board members who are females, and to help in having a better participation of women in the business sector. The final point is on access to finance. I will not talk a lot about it. I'm sure the time is limited, but it remains an important aspect, and there are many areas that can be talked about during the question and answer session on this topic or any of the other topics that I have mentioned. Thank you.
Many thanks for Your Excellency Maha Ali for this comprehensive and very valuable presentations that covered development in women empowerment front in Jordan and even in the region. Very, very, very useful presentations. I think you have much more to add, but the time, unfortunately, there is always time limit. But as you indicated, you may have another opportunity in Q&A session. Many thanks for your contribution, and we appreciate your time and your efforts. For our next presentation, we, I think, built on the presentations of Maha Ali, which related on how trade affect women, how trade affect men different than women, and what channels trade can affect women participation. So we'll hear to the details of this question from Ms. Jane Kornick, who is an economic and trade policy analyst in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. She holds a graduate degree in international economics policy from Stanford University. Her recent policy research has examined how trade impacts women and men differently, and how trade policies can support women economic empowerment and participation. Please, you can start, Mrs. Jane.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thanks for including me in this distinguished panel. With great pleasure. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about how trade and investment impact women and men differently. And then I'd like to go on to talk a little bit about how domestic policies and existing barriers to women's economic empowerment determine the impacts that trade has on women. And talk about a little bit about how some countries use trade-related instruments to cooperate on issues related to women's ability to trade. So first, trade and investment impact women and men differently, in part because they work and own businesses in different sectors. For example, women work more in services sectors, and in some countries in, for example, textiles and clothing. So of course, trade policies and trade agreements that create opportunities in sectors where women work will increase demand for those jobs that they might fill, and they will benefit from such trade agreements. If trade agreements create opportunities in sectors where primarily men work, then they will benefit. So trade impacts should be measured on men and women so that we better understand who is benefiting from this type of agreement and who is not. A second point as to how trade impacts women, in particular, women-owned businesses tend to be smaller than those owned by men. The previous speaker underlined that 74% of businesses, of women-owned businesses in Jordan are actually micro businesses. That's true in many countries. Women-owned businesses are smaller and they have less access to finance. So generally, policies that are put into place that favor micro and small enterprises favor women-owned businesses as well. In particular, trade facilitation reforms that make it easier for small businesses to import and export and mean that they do not have to spend a lot of time going through complex red tape and bureaucratic procedures. And the third area where trade impacts men and women differently that I'd like to cover is that one of the main gains from trade is that trade lowers prices for consumers. And this is felt most strongly by lower income households. This is because lower income households spend more of their income, and they are more impacted by higher prices. So lower import tariffs will lower consumer prices and particularly increase the purchasing power of more vulnerable households. And we also know that women are more predominantly found in lower income households due to a number of reasons. The gender wage gap, lower participation rates in employment, the fact that single parent households are in their majority women. And so lower import tariffs and lower consumer prices will positively impact the purchasing power, particularly of women and other vulnerable groups. And the last way that trade and investment impact women and men differently, research has shown that investment can have a positive impact on women's economic empowerment if importing firms put into practice some different and better practices than we find on the ground. In general, investment and multinational firms hire more women and they pay them more equally to men. Thereby, they tap into a pool of unused talent that local firms may hesitate to hire. And we have also seen somewhat of an imitation effect of local firms to follow these foreign firms in some cases. The second point I want to make is that domestic policies and existing barriers to women's economic empowerment strongly determine what kind of trade and to what extent women can engage in trade. This point was already covered by the previous speaker. She indicated that 15% of the Jordanian workforce is women, and only 6% of leadership roles are held by women. We know that the barriers that exist to more women entering the workforce, whether they be regulatory barriers, legal barriers, cultural norms, or unconscious bias, will also define the extent to which women engage in trade. And the areas of domestic policy are those that the distinguished minister touched on, including gender wage gaps, laws affecting women's decisions to work, including after having children, constraints related to marriage, and gender differences in property and inheritance. Some countries use trade-related instruments to cooperate on issues related to women's ability to trade, including in domestic policy areas. And I'd like to give you a few examples. The chair mentioned in his introductory remarks about the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, also called GTAGA. This is a group of 3 countries, Chile, Canada, and New Zealand, that have now been joined by a 4th, Mexico. And this is a cooperation agreement where participant countries engage and cooperate and share good practices in domestic policy areas as well as trade policy areas. They look into questions of gender wage gaps and how they tackle these questions in each country, financial inclusion, advancing women's leadership, and fostering women's entrepreneurship. These are all areas that we heard the distinguished minister refer to in terms of important areas for women's economic empowerment in Jordan. So would a country like Jordan want to join a group like GTAGA or engage in greater cooperation on women in trade in the Middle East and North Africa region? There's a great diversity of policies and experiences in the Middle East as regards women, women's empowerment, and women in trade. I'll talk about one other way that many countries leverage trade agreements for women's empowerment, and that is that they monitor existing conventions that they have signed on to on gender equality, or they subject them to dispute settlement within the context of a trade agreement. There are a number of conventions and either through the ILO or otherwise that are conventions on equal remuneration, non-discrimination, or the CEDAW Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which Jordan ratified in 1992. These are all conventions that can be included in a trade agreement, which through enforcement mechanisms ensures that their implementation is such on the ground. So that is another way that some countries include support women's economic empowerment through trade and trade agreements. And of course, the third soft law instrument is the Buenos Aires Declaration on Women in Trade in the WTO that has led to the formation of the WTO informal group on women and trade and women, which is a forum for sharing policy practices. But I'll leave that one to my fellow panelists, who is better placed to speak on that. Thank you so much.
For you, Mrs. Jane, for this very interesting presentations. Actually, we are learning from the presentations. In our classes in international trade, we used to give students a general positive relationship between trade openness and, of course, welfare, economic welfare of the country as a whole. But now from your presentation, I now know that trade openness and tax reduction will not affect homogeneity. Men and women will be affected differently, which is very, very useful and can be also constitute as topic for future possible research projects. Many thanks for the points you raised, and for the time, I would like to move to our next presenter, Ms. Simonetta Zarella. She is the Chief of Trade and Gender Development Program at UNCTAD. Simonetta has worked on many trade gender-related issues, including, for example, trade policies and gender equality, the challenges, benefits, and case strategies and initiatives. She is very involved in women empowerment initiatives at the global level. Please start your presentation, Ms. Simonetta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. And my short presentation will build upon the very interesting points made by the distinguished speakers who took the floor before me. I think one point that emerged clearly from previous presentations was that trade and gender are related. So there is a trade and trade policy have an impact on the well-being of women and on their empowerment. But this relationship is very country and sector specific. So we learned from the distinguished minister important data and development taking place in Jordan. And this really helps me making the point that that an analysis of the impact of trade on women and vice versa, the impact of gender inequality on trade competitiveness, should be done on a case-by-case basis. So I would like to very briefly talk about two instruments that are increasingly used to have a clearer idea of the impact of trade on women, that are the ex-ante and the ex-post gender impact assessment. So the ex-ante gender impact assessment are instruments that basically help answering the question, what would happen to women if a certain trade measure is implemented? And this is a very important question. I think that in the past, trade negotiators would mainly assess what would be the impact of a new agreement, of a new measure on a country as a whole. The next step that is happening now is to see that there is an overall impact, but there is an impact on specific segments of the population, including on men and women. So now the effort is to try to understand what could be the intended and the unintended effects of a trade measure on men and women. And here I would like to refer, I mentioned that the countries are really fully understanding the importance of making this ex-ante gender assessment. And for instance, let me refer to the EU, which regularly carries out the sustainability impact assessment of the agreements, the trade agreements under negotiations. And these assessments have a social, an environmental, and a gender component. And the gender component that used to be a kind of Cinderella of the assessment is now getting much more relevance. Another example that I would like to mention is the gender-based analysis plus that Canada is using to assess all policies and including trade policies. And let me share that UNCTAD, my organization, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, developed a methodology for the ex-ante gender assessment. And this is exactly to respond to this need to understand what could be the intended and unintended consequences of a trade measure that can be a unilateral trade measure or can be a trade measure within a trade agreement. And we have used the methodology we have developed to make the assessment of the impact of on Kenyan women on the economic partnership agreement between the European Union and the Eastern African Community. And this is proved to be a very interesting exercise because, for instance, we reached the conclusion that while the overall impact of the agreement would be positive, because it would provide more export opportunities and so would be positive for exporters. It would be positive for consumers because prices would go down at the point that Jane just made. But if we look at the specific, if we get more granular, we saw that there would be some unintended negative implications for employment, and especially for the sector, for some sectors where women work, like textile and tobacco. So this is just an example of how, through a gender impact assessment ex-ante, you can have an idea of what can happen. And this is very useful for policymakers because then if there are negative consequences, they can modify the terms of the agreement they are negotiating, or they can put in place buffer measures to avoid having losers as a result of the agreement. Quickly moving to the ex-post gender impact assessment. As you know, in many agreements, trade and cooperation agreements, and especially in regional trade agreements, there are gender goals, gender equality, women's empowerment goals to be reached. So in UNCTAD, we looked at a number of regional integration agreements in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South America. And we saw that there were commitments in some of these regional integration treaties, the treaties establishing the regional integrations. There were clear commitments toward the gender equality and women's empowerment. And then our exercise was to look at if these commitments have been met in reality. And in most cases, what emerged from this ex-post evaluation was that indeed regional integration had provided the new employment opportunities for women. That is indeed a very positive development, a positive contribution of trade to women empowerment. But we also saw that the kind of employment that was created was more at the level of basic jobs, so jobs that don't involve managerial or high-level skills. And this is a kind of worrisome consideration, because while we know that providing employment opportunities for women is very important, not all jobs are empowering. There are jobs that include skills development, managerial skills development, etc., are jobs that can truly empower women, while other jobs that don't involve career development, skill development, that are paid with very basic salaries, are not the kind of jobs that can truly empower women. So this is another example of how looking at what an agreement, the purposes of an agreement, and what has been happening, and checking after a certain number of years if the goals had been met, is a very useful instrument for policymakers who can adjust their policies, their strategies to make sure that what they had agreed upon, what they had committed, including for the good of women, is indeed fulfilled. So these are the two instruments that I wanted to highlight in my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Simonetta, for this informative presentation. Actually, it is interesting to know that not all jobs are woman empowering. There is some certain jobs that only pay a basic salary, low salary, without any additional development of skills that are, of course, cannot be considered empowering. Second issue that is interesting for me, I found, you are introducing new instruments to evaluate gender policies and trade policies. I wonder if this means kind of RIA analysis for policies, or you mean something different? You know, regulatory impact assessments for policies. This is what you meant by these instruments to evaluate policies?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, these are instruments. The Ex-Ante gender impact assessment is an instrument to evaluate the possible impact of a trade measure, for example, a trade agreement on women. And the ex-post impact assessment are instruments to evaluate if indeed the policies met the objectives included in, for example, in the treaty setting up regional integration. So these are very concrete policy instruments that are being used by a number of countries and by international organizations which are supporting countries doing this kind of assessments. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, Simonetta. I think this is what we need in third world countries, actually, always to introduce RIA analysis for any policy we introduce, which is very important. I think it's widely used in advanced countries, but in developing countries still in the first stage. For our final presentation, actually it is a joint presentation based on ongoing research on trade agreements, women businesses, and COVID-19. The research is conducted jointly by Anoush Dirbogofian, head of trade and gender at the World Trade Organization, and my dear friend Amrita Bahri. She's associate professor of international law, trade law at Mexico ITAM, and co-chair for the WTO Share program. I would like to invite you first. I think Anoush will start with her presentation. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And,
It's yours.
yes. Thank you, Professor. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, we will. Amrita and I will talk about our recent paper on how the pandemic has impacted businesswomen and how trade agreements and policies can actually lift them out of these additional obstacles that women are facing due to the pandemic. So I'll start with analyzing how the pandemic has impacted women entrepreneurs, and Amrita will go then to the trade agreements and the trade policies that can support women in these dire circumstances. So actually, the pandemic has exacerbated the barriers that women are facing, and I would say especially in access to finance and of course access to trade. And we can see that they are facing a three-wave impact, let's say. We have a first impact, which is mostly looking at a fund freeze of their businesses. So they're facing this fund freeze. That means that women entrepreneurs are really facing a shortage in the cash cycle because of the loss of sale, loss of customers, the supply chain restrictions. And for example, the WTO, we did a survey in Latin America, and we found that 70% of the women entrepreneurs are facing specific financial challenges. and difficulties in paying the loan interest that they have, and also paying their clients. And 75% of them also covered the cost of managing workers, their health, their safety, all sorts of different payments related to human resources. So basically, now they have no cash anymore. That's why we're talking about the fund freeze. And actually, it's a term that is being used by women entrepreneurs themselves. So this fund freeze was worsened by the fact that actually women entrepreneurs did not have access to the financial recovery packages done by the government or set up by the government, because the government didn't really design the packages in line with what women entrepreneurs' needs. I mean, as Ms. Maha was saying earlier, she was saying that only 2.5% of women entrepreneurs could access the financial packages or relief packages that the government had set up. Well, actually, if you look at the global level, it's more or less similar. If we look at the global level, only 9% of all the measures that were set up by governments to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 support women's economic security. So it's kind of, if you look at the global picture, then it's kind of a similar picture. In fact, women entrepreneurs were actually unable to access any of these schemes, because actually the requirements set up in those schemes are too dire for women entrepreneurs. Sometimes they request that the company has more than a number of employees. And we know that women entrepreneurs are mostly micro companies or are just self-employed. So they are de facto excluded from these schemes. Some of these schemes simply just continue existing loans, which women entrepreneurs don't have, because actually women entrepreneurs really don't have access to the traditional financial schemes that are set up by financial institutions. I mean, if we look at the SME Finance Forum reports, for example, we see that women-owned businesses account for 32% of the MSME finance gap. That represents about $1.7 trillion of unmet credit demand. So if you see that picture and you put it in parallel to what's happening in the COVID-19 context, then you see that these women are really de facto excluded from these schemes. So that's the first impact wave, I would say. The second impact wave is because of all that, because of the fund freeze, because they don't have access to financial support, then of course they have to close their business, either temporarily or permanently. And if we look at the global picture again, we see that according to the World Bank, women entrepreneurs had 6% more chances to close their businesses than male-owned firms. And if we see the sectors where most of the closures happened, we see that it happened mostly in the travel and tourism sectors, hospitality and event services, education and childcare services, arts and entertainment, hospitality, as I said. So these are sectors where actually women entrepreneurs are concentrated. So that's the consequence of the first wave impact. Now we're looking at the third wave impact, which is these situations have a spillover effect on women's businesses, household, and also their female employees. Of course, as a result of losing their businesses, women entrepreneurs have lost their entire means of earning income and subsistence. And as most of them are sole owner of the businesses, that's even a stronger dire consequences of the pandemic. Also, women mostly contribute to their family house expenses like rent or education. This is the second pillar of investment after their business. And the third pillar where women reinvest their income is the participation in the overall family income. So basically, what it means is that they cannot support their family anymore, and that has consequences on their children's education and health. Also, looking at the female employees of these business women, we see that for very small firms, a lot of women workers are actually female. And these female workers, by consequence, are losing their jobs and their livelihood. So this is something that this is kind of looks at the overall picture. And the issue is that because they don't have these means anymore, they cannot really afford to trade. Because trade has a cost. So if you look at for example, simple export or trade costs, such as investing in specialized IT systems or skilled staff to deal with customs issues, packaging, certification, standards compliance, all these issues have a cost attached to them. They also lack of knowledge of trade rules and proceedings is another important cost that they have to face. They don't have the money, so how can they really invest in trade and really take advantage of trade? This is another spillover effect of the pandemic. So basically, another issue is, if women have difficulties accessing finance, then it comes to trade finance. It's even harder for them to have access to trade finance. We can see also that female cross-border traders, they have additional costs because for safety reasons, for example, they have to resort to using services, transport services that normally they would do themselves. So these would have an additional cost to their business. So, and of course, to their trade. So in fact, we also see that there is a lot of, I would say, means and tools that women were using to be able to access international markets, such as, for example, networking. It's been COVID-19 has made it difficult for women to network. It has also made it difficult for women to be part of trade fair, for example. These women entrepreneurs are often selling their products and services through trade fairs at the international level, at the regional level. Of course, these were shut down at some point because of the COVID-19, so they could no longer really do their trade. And so in the end, we see that we have some initiatives that can support women facing the consequences of COVID-19. And actually the WTO members are looking at these issues as part of the informal working group on trade and gender. So as Jane was mentioning, and this group now is really working towards the 12th ministerial conference to adopt a new declaration that goes far beyond the Buenos Aires Declaration, and really sets up some recommendations and commitments for members to go beyond just sharing experience and really work on, for example, on data collection. I think Werner mentioned that the data was really lacking, on how to mainstream gender better in aid for trade, for example, on using research to inform policy making. So these are really concrete actions that members are currently working on to adopt at the ministerial conference at the end of this year. And I will pass on the floor to Amrita, because I'm talking about these different platforms at the international level that could be helping women face the consequences of the pandemic. But actually we have in free trade agreements and in current trade policies, we have some solutions that can be used to support women in this difficult situation. And I will let Amrita talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anush. Please, Amrita, you can complement the presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Taleb. Thank you, Anush. It's always a difficult job to be the last speaker, not only because of the time restrictions, but in this case, in this context, especially after listening to such stellar, such interesting, thought-provoking presentations by my fellow panelists. It is difficult to live up to the challenge, but I will still try and live up to it So not very optimistic about it, because the presentations have raised so many thoughts and so many new ideas on what more needs to be done. So looking at the second part of our paper that Anush and I have done together, the question that the second part tries to answer is, can existing trade agreements help overcome the barriers that Anush explained? The answer is yes. As countries can use these negotiating instruments to incentivize changes at the domestic level in exchange for an enhanced market access. So it is pretty much the lure of market access to markets that can work in this respect. And it is so interesting to see that more and more countries today are now including gender concerns in their trade agreements, though in very different ways. In this paper that Anush and I have recently concluded, we explore the potential of existing trade agreements to empower women businesses and help them deal with the pandemic magnified challenges. So as we speak, of all FTAs in force, about 20% have at least one explicit gender provision. And we can expect many more future agreements to accommodate these concerns as gender mainstreaming is gaining a lot of traction in the past few years. But majority of these agreements have not included provisions that directly seek to uphold or expand business interest. Most of these existing trade agreements, what we have found, accommodate and talk about gender provisions that mostly treat women as laborers, social actors, or as mothers. So of course, gender-related provisions vary from one region to the other, but then majority of them have focused on education and training, women's employment, labor standards, equality, physical safety, and health concerns. Having said that, there are some best practice examples we have found in existing trade agreements that can help in reducing the barriers that Anush mentioned in respect of business. In our paper, we divide these best practice examples under 5 different categories. But for the interest of time, let me just talk about 2 of these, because that will help me provide you an initial teaser to prompt you all to read our upcoming paper. So the first kind of provisions are the reservations that allow women favoring measures such as procurement schemes and subsidies. As we have heard, current COVID-19 relief packages are excluding women-owned businesses from their list of beneficiaries. Unintentionally so, but they are excluding women business beneficiaries. So going forward, governments may consider offering various support schemes to small businesses that can particularly impact women businesses in the shape of state aid, government bailouts, loans or subsidies, or women favoring government procurement measures, which is indeed a very important market, but still unexplored for women traders. But the question here is, are these measures even legally consistent? Are they consistent with the WTO laws? Are they consistent with the trade agreements? Well, in several existing trade agreements, countries have reserved a right to engage in measures that could otherwise be inconsistent with their obligations under a given trade agreement. For example, South Korea, Singapore Free Trade Agreement. In this agreement, parties reserve with them the right to regulate and provide financial benefits to small businesses owned by women that may need such relief during this pandemic. And now the second type of provisions are focused on enhancing women's access to finance and other productive resources. Something which is again very interesting, as Anush mentioned, and this is one point that was raised by Jane and by the Honorable Minister, that the lack of finance is one of the key barriers that impede women's business and endeavors in international trade. This barrier is very much acknowledged in several trade agreements, not 1 or 2, but several as we speak. In Canada-Israel trade agreement, for example, the parties seek to cooperate on promoting financial inclusion for women through provision of financial training, increase in access to finance, and financial assistance. And if we look beyond these inclusions in trade agreements, the WTO members have reported in their trade policy review reports that they have set up financial support programs for MSMEs. They have reserved specific quotas for women-owned companies to receive such funding, and they have set up training programs to train women on how to handle finances and open bank accounts and so on and so forth. Then lack of access to information about cross-border trade regulations and procedures also impede women from availing business opportunities. And studies have repeatedly shown how women traders have faced problems in accessing trade-related information regarding compliance with border procedures, tariffs, exchange rate fluctuations, custom procedures, product standards, and so on and so forth. So this information is so critical for businesses to make economically sound and well-informed decisions that lack of information, lack of access to this information indeed becomes a barrier for these women businesses. In several trade agreements, for example, ECOWAS, parties seek to encourage this flow of information among women businesses. That's a best practice provision. So looking ahead, we have these existing trade agreements, but what's missing? What more is needed to make these provisions work, right? I think the answer is implementation, finance, and enforcement. There are three fundamental problems in putting these beautiful, and in the words of Simonetta, these...
You got 1 minute more.
Sure. These Cinderella provisions into action. One, most of these provisions cannot be enforced. Second, almost all trade agreements, including these gender commitments, they include these gender commitments without talking about how they will go about financing them. And third, with few exceptions, most of these agreements do not provide for any institution or procedure to implement these commitments. And without implementation, finance, and enforcement, it is difficult to see how these provisions or how these agreements might actually work to improve the lives of women and their businesses post-pandemic. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Amrita and Anoush, for very informative and useful presentation. I'm sorry because of time limitations. I have to, sometimes I know that you have too much more to say and to explain, but this is, in fact, time is limited. I think your presentation is raising many questions. First, women are discriminated against in terms of trade finance, trade cost, access to information and educational skills, and lack of knowledge sometimes is a barrier. My question that is, I get it listening to Amrita, part of the presentation, do we need to adjust WTO rules to be, to be more pro empowering women, or countries can do additional policies within trade agreements within the going WTO rules?
Thank you for the question, Professor Talib. Is that for me or for Anoush? Or?
For anyone who would like to.
I
think I am asking you because you mentioned about the agreement, and sometimes it's not easy for countries to introduce empowering issues, policies into agreements because of WTO rules.
Yes, thank you for the question. Very relevant indeed. And my short answer to this is that we all know, and we cannot ignore the fact that the WTO rulebook is completely gender blind as we speak. I might be scared to be speaking about this right now with my co-author Anoush is here on this panel with me. But it is completely gender blind. In other words, WTO rulebook does not contain a single gender explicit provision or commitment. Having said so, there are various agreements and provisions in the WTO rulebook that are implicitly gender responsive, including the agreement on agriculture, the trade facilitation agreement, the trade agreement in services, the government procurement plurilateral agreement, and so on and so forth. And even Article 20A, which is the exception, the GATT exception to protect public morality, has a huge potential to invoke women favoring measures. It has not been done so far, but I would expect that members, especially during this pandemic and other future crises, can provide women favoring measures to help and support women businesses. And even though these measures may seem to be WTO inconsistent, they can be justified under Article 20A of public morality exception.
Thank you, Amrita and Noosh. I think we almost finish our time for this webinar, but I may take additional 10 minutes for Q&A if you agree with me, since we promised to have a short session, about 10 minutes for question and answers. I have some questions here, and of course you can see the questions up there in the chat, I think, chat box, or yeah. One of the questions that is being asked by Frederick, I think, is for His Excellency, Their Excellency Maha Ali. Jordan has negotiated 2 agreements with ambitious provisions on women empowerment, Canada, Jordan, and Jordan agreements. However, most of other trade agreements remain silent on the current. What is Jordan's view about adding gender equality related comments in trade agreements in the future? And are there any hesitations or doubts that decision-making share in this respect in Jordan? This is the question for your expression. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Talib, and thank you for raising the question. Just to clarify, our FTAs with Canada and the association agreement with the EU does not include specific provisions on women empowerment. What we have with Canada, actually, it's a separate agreement from the FTA. It's a labor cooperation agreement, and it has a number of provisions, most related to ILO conventions and international commitments of both countries. The question is important, and I think the speakers mentioned it in their interventions on trade agreements and whether these agreements should include provisions related to gender or not. Actually, it's difficult to give a clear answer on this issue. The FTAs in Jordan mostly have provisions purely on trade. Some of them have other provisions on cooperation areas other than trade, but related to trade. Gender issue, I think it has to be looked at cautiously when we talk about trade agreements. Because countries vary in the level of their policies, their priorities, their legislative procedures when it comes to gender and women economic empowerment. It is important, but I don't think that only trade agreements will provide the solution. Rather than domestic policies need also to address these issues with policies, legislations that would encourage women economic participation.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I have another questions for all of the presenters. Given the current improvement in terms of gender gap, how long do you think it will take to eliminate totally the gender gap worldwide? I mean, does it take 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? Maybe if you have some idea about your forecast or your expectations, would be welcome. Any of the presenters?
Right, if I may answer to that one. Actually,
Yes,
I think,
yes, please.
Thank you. So I think now we've added about 36 years to the 100 years that we need to achieve gender equality globally. So we're now facing 100, maybe I would say maybe a sentence, I don't know if this is the right word, of 136 years before we can close the gender gap. This has been, of course, a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. So it's still a long way ahead. I have another question from Liz. Yeah. Why do you think women participate less on B2B meetings? This is how I get the question. And of course, first and abroad trips. The question is not clear for me.
And how would you promote women participation on this event?
And how you promote women participation in such events? Fairs and abroad trips. This is the question.
I can start to answer that, and I'm
yes,
sure that
please, Jane. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sure the distinguished minister will have other things to say, because I think that was related to something that she had covered in her talk. This is something that is not only found in Jordan, but in many countries around the world. Women are less represented in traditional business networks. I believe the minister suggested that this is the case also in Jordan. Sometimes these kind of traditional business networks are viewed as kind of, men's clubs, and they seem to work less well for women. And in some cases, when missions or fairs are being organized, participants in these kind of networks are the ones who actually end up going. There's also a reason why fewer women participate in these kind of meetings is that there are many fewer women entrepreneurs. So that's kind of, almost to be expected. Women also have less time to put into their networks and do kind of, extra things outside of their, day-to-day business due to the large amount of unpaid work that they do in the home. Responsibilities in the home for household chores, looking after children, looking after elders. And so what to do about it? Well, in some countries, they actually prioritize women entrepreneurs and greater diversity when these kind of trade missions are organized. This is something that has been done in North America, and Canada, and the US for quite a number of years. They look at the profile of people that they bring across and look to show a more diverse group of entrepreneurs, and also of sectors. If they're covering a particular sector and they choose a sector where there are lots of women entrepreneurs, they end up bringing over many more women. I just wanted to make one more point, and that is that there's also this idea of tokenism, right? And what we find in this kind of setting, but also in the question came up about women on boards. Sometimes there's one woman. That's not going to change the culture. There has to be a certain number of women in order to really have a more diverse group. And it depends on the group, and we don't know exactly what that number is, but it certainly isn't one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I think the last question will be, I get it from Khawla, how we could strengthen the capability of women's organization and decision makers to effectively negotiate trade policies, international and regional institutions. This is the question, and it is for any one of our distinguished presenters to answer. Okay, anyone would like to add something on this question?
If I
can.
okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Samantha. No, go ahead. I'll maybe compliment what you say.
Okay, so anyone of you can go ahead. I think Simonetta want to say something.
Yeah, I think that we have seen a very little participation of women and women's organization in when agreements are negotiated, and maybe now with these new features of having trade and gender chapters included in trade agreements, or having in general gender considerations included in trade agreements, this may make these agreements, may make the negotiations of these agreements more interesting for women's group, women's business associations that can immediately see that they can gain something, that if they are involved, if they participate, the outcome may be more favorable to them. So I think these new developments in a way open, hopefully will open the way to have more women's group and the business association of women involved in the negotiations of the new agreements and in their implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simonetta. Actually, I think we have many more questions, but time is not allowing us to answer all the questions. I think we can send the questions to presenters later on, and they can send it by email. Is that a good idea? Sounds for you? Okay, thank you. Last but not least, I would like to ask my dear friend, Dorita Lopez, the director of Center of Trade and Policy Studies at the University of Chile and the WTO shareholder, to provide the concluding remarks for this webinar. Lopez, please go ahead.
Thanks, Professor Watt. I really just wanted to thank first the WTO Chairs program. I think they made possible not to have cooperation amongst our region, to cross our region, and also to cross the continents. It has been a great experience to coordinate this important topic amongst the WTO chairs. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers. They made, as Amrita said, extraordinary relevant points. We have a lot of new ideas to research. I mean, we as universities have the responsibility of working in these topics. And as Anush said, we still have a long time to go on working on these topics and a lot of challenges to overcome. I want to really thank the two ministers. They highlighted how relevant is this topic for their governments, which plans they have, and how important it is to be connected, the academy, the international organization, and the government, in order to achieve and try to short the long time that Anush has highlighted before. Last but not least, I want to thank Professor Bari and Professor Awad for this excellent cooperation, and I hope this is one of many more conference, seminars, books, research that we can do together. Thanks to everybody to join us, and the best for you. Good afternoon in Amman and good morning in Mexico.
Many thanks for you, Dorita. Thank you all our distinguished presenters for today great presentations, and thank you attendee and audience of this webinar. On behalf of the organizing committee of webinar, allow me to extend our thanks to the University of Jordan, the University of Chile, and Mexico ITAM for their continuous support for the chair activities, and for, of course, we will not forget the WTO for sponsoring the very successful chair program. Before ending the webinar, I would like to announce that the WTO chair of the University of Jordan is planning a virtual conference on the same topic, trade and gender gap. It will be in the mid of December. You are all invited to participate. For more information on the conference, you can find it at the website, University of Jordan School of Business. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you hopefully next time. Bye-bye.